Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining this session today on improving the visibility of local and national actors. I'm just going to share my screen. You can see this. So I'm Mark Brough. I'm working with Development Initiatives as a Senior Technical Advisor on our support to the Grand Bargain Transparency Workstream. I wanted to just give some quick overview and insights into some work that we've been doing over the last months to look at how we can improve the visibility of local and national actors, also looking at IATI data. I'll jump to the first slide. So as part of the Grand Bargain to improve the way that the humanitarian system works, there are some specific commitments around improving the proportion of funding that goes through local and national actors. And one of the challenges of this is basically to kind of support those organizations to kind of share more information on what they're doing and to gain a better understanding of exactly what local and national actors, how they're taking part in the humanitarian system as a whole. One thing to start with, I have a bit of a cold, so hopefully I don't splutter, but if I do, then I apologize in advance. So in late 2020, we launched a project as part of our support to the Grand Bargain Transparency Workstream to look at how we can identify some potential technical solutions to enable increased visibility of local and national actors in IATI without kind of adding any additional reporting burden onto those organizations. So recognizing that for particularly small organizations, it's going to be a lot of work to kind of start publishing that data to IATI, maybe directly through something like AidStream or publishing directly themselves. We wanted to understand how we could use existing processes and systems to support them to publish their data to IATI as well, or to get a better understanding of what's happening as a whole. So we undertook a pilot project in Somalia, aiming to identify some data sources at the local and national levels that we could basically integrate with IATI data to kind of gain a bigger picture. And the main data source that we looked at here was the 3W reports published by UN OCHA. We finished now the first phase, and we wanted to basically share where we've got to so far and get feedback on our recommendations and next steps. Okay, so what are the potential benefits of kind of trying to combine this data from these different sources together? So we identified quite a lot of different benefits from increasing the visibility of local and national actors. So greater recognition of local actors to understand the kind of and fairly credit them for the part they play in the coordination, the humanitarian response as a whole. To provide for enhanced coordination between those local actors and other actors as well. To provide for enhanced accountability so that we can trace activities through funding chains. And then finally to enhance progress against commitments so that we can understand the extent to which different organizations are meeting their Grand Bargain commitments in terms of localization. So what data is available from these different sources, and why does it make sense to try and look at IATI as well as 3W? So we found that local actors weren't easily visible in IATI alone, but if we combined IATI and 3W, we got a much richer picture of the network of aid actors, including the local actors. So in IATI, there's a lot of activities available. So this is from the 1st of January 2020. So activities which were still ongoing as of 1st January 2020 through to, I think it was May this year. So in the of the IATI actors, 80 have published activities around this humanitarian activities in Somalia. All of these publishers are international, and there were a few local actors listed as implementing partners, but they're not well coded. So we had to go through and manually recode those organizations to say, okay, this organization that we can see here, actually, it is a local actor. In 3W, there are 153 organizations, so there are more organizations reporting. Many of these are local actors, and other publishers also sometimes list their local partners and upstream donors. So the idea was also to a little bit to see, well, can we find connections between these different data sets as well? So where are the local actors in IATI data? So as I said, we could go through and manually recode the IATI data to try and identify local actors as well. So none of the reporting organizations in IATI for Somalia were had identified themselves as local actors. But we did identify some, very few participating organizations that were local actors. This is 38 of, just under kind of 0.1%. 3,822 mentions of participating organizations. And we didn't find any provider or receiver organizations and transactions that were mentioned as local. Okay. The one other thing to mention on this actually is also that of the local actors that were mentioned in the IATI data, most of these were implementing partners of Oxfam Novib. So Oxfam Novib had done a particularly good job of recoding their activities to say that these were this particular organization type 24, which is participating, so partner country based NGO. So when we look at the network of actors in IATI data, and this is again, from this combination of recoding the data manually, and also some of the, in some cases where the organizations have been explicitly identified by Oxfam Novib, we found that most of the local actors are clustered primarily around UN OCHA, so the pooled funds, and also Oxfam Novib. So I think this is UN OCHA here, and this is Oxfam Novib, if I'm not mistaken. You can see that most of the local actors are also only mentioned once, so you don't see lots of links between the red dots for the local actors and other organizations as well. When we look at 3W data, we can see a much broader network, and again, this is because there are far more organizations reporting in the 3W, the local 3W data, and we see far more of those that are local actors as well. But we also don't see some of the context, so some of the, where the funding streams are coming from above this as well. We see lots of the local actors are also clustered around big UN agencies like WFP, FAO, UNICEF, and UNHCR. And we also see that lots of the actors are mentioned multiple times as well. So we do see, many cases where some of these red dots, the local actors, also have links to other parts of the network as well. So it's kind of a more a richer network in a way. So I click back, sorry. Okay, so when we combine the IATI and 3W data, this is what we see. So it's a much richer picture than only looking at one of them by themselves. And we can see, while IATI lacks information about local actors, when we link through the programming organizations, we get the international context that's currently missing from 3W. So we see that both data sets have some advantages, but when we combine them together, there's much greater advantages as well. To kind of maybe make the same point differently. So this is sorry, I jumped forward a couple of slides. Okay, so when we look at just IATI for Somalia, sorry, this slide is confused. Okay, so when we just look at IATI for Somalia, which is on the left-hand side, we can see that the activities are clustered in a couple of strongly in a couple of regions. So this one down here in the bottom, in the sort of bottom right, a very small one, this is Mogadishu. And then we can see there's a bunch also clustered in the middle of the country. When we combine IATI and 3W, we get a much sort of softer distribution of throughout the country. And we also see that there's more of a clustering in the southwest of the country. So this is actually providing us with, both a more detailed picture, but also a slightly different picture from what we get only from IATI. Okay. So what did we do? We did a lot of sort of data management, kind of cleaning, processing, pulling the data together between IATI and 3W. We tried to establish links between activities at sort of 3 aggregate levels. So between organizations that are mentioned in IATI and those that are mentioned in 3W, between locations, so the administrative classifications, the first and the second levels, so the regions and the districts. And thirdly, in terms of sectors also, so we mapped from the OECD DAC CRS sectors to the humanitarian clusters that are used in 3W reports. You can go and explore this if you want to. It's iat-3w.homeportal.org, and I'll add, or maybe Verity can add also a link in the chat also to this. Okay, so based on this work, we have some recommendations and a lot of thinking this is kind of provoked for us as well. So there's some recommendations which focus particularly on IATI itself and on IATI publishers as well. So it may be unrealistic to expect that local actors, a very large number of very small local actors, will publish directly to IATI themselves, but we can get quite a lot of the way there by the larger organizations that are publishing to IATI, so donors or multilaterals or their large international implementing partners, consistently stating the name of the implementing partners. And of course, this won't always be possible for sensible reasons. We had this session earlier today on responsibility around transparency and around what data would actually make sense to publish, and in order to avoid causing harm to actors. But where there aren't those issues, consistently stating the name of your implementing partners allows us to get further down the chain than would otherwise be possible. And this is particularly the case with some multilaterals, where we found that there was kind of like a consistent approach, and not only in Somalia, but in other places too, to not state the name of the implementing partners at all, and maybe just states either general categories or nothing at all. So secondly, to credit local partners you work with for an activity. And thirdly, to label organizations correctly using the new, well, now not so new, but the organization type code list 24 for partner country-based NGO, or 72, which is private sector neighborhood receiving country. So this allows you to say not only that it's an NGO, but that it's based in the partner country, for example. We also thought about maybe some improvements to the IATI standard itself. So one option could be to have some enhancements to the organization type code list, so that you can say whether the government is actually based in the partner country or not. Or actually, this may be another option, to basically have a significant improvement in the use of organization identifiers. And this may also require kind of an improvement in the development of a kind of consistent methodology in some cases as well. For example, to have a better way of referring to public bodies, to government institutions, this kind of thing, that then from the organization identifier itself, maybe then you could work backwards to identify which country this organization is supposed to be based in. So yeah, first of all, we can get quite a long way to improving the visibility of local and national actors just through improved IATI publication by existing IATI publishers, particularly by large implementing organizations, or those that receive kind of pass-through funding and then pass on to other actors further down the chain. But we also found that there were benefits to integrating IATI and 3W data, also without, and that we can basically capture more information on what local and national actors are doing without increasing the reporting burden on them. The way that we had to undertake this, though, it was a very labor-intensive exercise. We had to do lots of manual recoding of data. And that's obviously not realistic to, it's not it's not realistic to use that process to be able to scale to other countries, or to be able to quickly release these kinds of dashboards and things immediately, in the, when they would be useful at the start of a response, for example. So we thought about a couple of other recommendations here. Firstly, standardization of 3W outputs. So this would involve, in Somalia, it was relatively easier compared with other countries to do this, because the 3W templates are published consistently and in a good format, and they're published in the same place and they're updated over time. But this isn't the case for all 3W reports, and so having some sort of standardization with UN OCHA would maybe be a useful way to be able to roll this thing out more easily in future. And secondly, as I mentioned before, also getting IATI publication to just above the level of the 3W data, so that it is realistic to be able to start creating those links between the IATI and 3W data, which again requires some of the things I spoke about on the previous slide around having organizations consistently mentioned as implementing organizations. Okay, so finally, a few discussion questions. There's lots of things on this slide. I thought about splitting it up onto 2 different slides, but perhaps it's useful just to have them here, that they can then be used as kind of prompts for discussion in this session. So we have a general open question around where we should take this next. So we got a lot of very positive feedback on the original dashboards that we shared back in, I think, May this year. But there's a lot of other open questions also, I think, with this prompt. So, what information is needed at the local national level to enhance visibility, coordination, accountability, and monitoring of local actors? And, can IATI alone achieve this? Or does 3W provide us with valuable insights? And if that's the case, then how do we make that process and those linkages and interoperability between those data sets work consistently in future and in other places, not only in Somalia? How can we incentivize IATI publishers to improve publication? And in this case, we've highlighted in INGOs and UN agencies, because these were the ones where we found that there was a general approach of, particularly in some of the UN agencies, to not publish the names of the implementing organizations they're working with. And also then to consistently use organization identifiers as well, which we found were extremely limited in the data for Somalia. And then we have a set of questions around, how do we, if we want to collect more information and get more information together on what local national actors are doing, how do we do this without increasing the reporting burden on frontline actors? And the one question we've added on at the end here is, should we be considering a last mile version of the IATI standard? So where for local actors, maybe we're less interested in exactly, how they've spent every dollar. And maybe we're much more interested in understanding, where they're working and who they're working with, who the beneficiaries are, what the results are. And if we can link back up maybe to another organization's IATI publication, then we get a lot of the financial information anyway, without having to add that reporting burden onto those actors as well. Is that something we should be thinking about? Because that would also imply maybe some changes or some a maybe simpler or more relaxed version of the IATI standard, where organizations wouldn't, for example, wouldn't be expected to publish financials, for example. We also found this in some of our discussions that that could be a barrier to or create reluctance around those organizations in sharing information at all, both because of the reporting burden and because it would because there's so much very fierce competition around a very scarce resources at that level as well. So here are some open questions. Really very much welcome, feedback, thoughts on all of this. This was quite experimental piece of work, and it's been very interesting to undertake. So yeah, we're really interested to hear what everyone has to say. I should have mentioned at the start, but I think I jumped straight in too quickly. I wanted to also thank David Meganson, who undertook a lot of this work with and for us. And unfortunately, he's not able to be here today due to personal reasons, but I wanted to say thanks also to him for the work that he's done on this. So I think here I can see. So yeah, if you have thoughts or questions on this, I have some in the chat as well. If you have things to say, then please, someone's raised a hand. Pele, go ahead. I think you should be able to. Okay, go ahead, Pele.
Yeah, there I am. And in picture as well. Right.
Yes.
Thanks, Mark. Really interesting presentation. With regards to discussion questions, I will really appreciate number 3, the suggestion on number 4. It is the suggestion to look at different sets of IATI data for different types of publishers. For those who don't know me, I also work with the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And especially in discussions around localization, etc., usually we're not even able to publish data. We sometimes don't even know to which humanitarian response plan we contribute, because it's all in bulk contributions to big UN organizations or so. So I really appreciate the thought of thinking about, well, different sets of data, parts of the IATI standard for different types of publishers, because local actors have, well, really other types of information they could present than for instance, institutional donors. And I think the same goes for all the parties in between. I really like that. I have a personal problem with the naming of Code 24 for partner country NGOs. I've previously also worked with the Netherlands Red Cross, which would self-identify as an international NGO and work with all kinds of country-based Red Crosses around the world, who would always self-identify as national NGOs. And I think so this kind of comes across as a global north perspective, where we say these are partner-based NGOs, and I think they would self-identify as being national NGOs or something like that. So that is something to think about. So those are my 2 cents for now, but appreciate to keep the discussion open.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it makes sense, and that, you know, there are a few others in the chat that say similar things as well. I mean, we still don't have this problem, right? Though, if we want to monitor this, you know, it's not only about this particular commitment, but also if we want to monitor this Grand Bargain commitment around increasing localization to local actors, how do we actually monitor that, you know, in a way that, aside from kind of just self-reporting by organizations, in a consistent, replicable, you know, comparable way across organizations, if we don't use this particular code, right? And the obvious way to, I think, to do this would be, you know, to have a consistent, very strong, you know, clear methodology and use of organization identifiers, so that you could say, well, okay, if the organization is based in X country, then we'll take them as, we'll say that they count, you know, as towards meeting this commitment, for example. And I think it's also, you know, probably, you know, even aside from that commitment, there are lots of benefits to be able to understand which organizations and where actually receiving these funds also has obviously a big impact on, you know, the nature of the response. If the funds are going to, you know, an organization based in Germany or the Netherlands or the UK, or based in the country as well, you know, how much of those funds, you know, what happens with those funds, you know. But we don't really have.
Thinking about the IATI standard, we could perhaps introduce a country code for an organization.
I mean, we sort of have this anyway, right? Because with organization identifiers, they generally start with a country code. So this is what I meant in terms of using the organization identifier. But the problem is that at the moment there's such a, you know, limited usage of those organization identifiers at all, that we wouldn't really be able to use this. So I think it would be good to think about kind of a big push to incentivize and encourage publishers to be using organization identifiers consistently. And there are some that do use them very well. So I mean, just because I see Anna's name in the chat, also, you know, Canada definitely publishes very good organization identifiers, at least in lots of cases that I've seen as well. I'm sure there are other publishers that are the case as well. So it's definitely possible.
I also see Stephen in the chat who says that for multiple countries it's very hard to establish a known registry because they might just be paper-based, etc. That's an experience we also have with partners in, for instance, DRC. I think also, well, don't remember, there's a few Latin American countries as well, where it's very hard to find a registry for organizations. So that method has its limitations. But happy to give the floor to someone else.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be good to have like a proper discussion, and maybe it's a separate thing for another time, but on, you know, what do we do about organization identifiers? Because it feels like this is, you know, a topic that we've had discussions on in the past, and very good discussions also in IATI events, and also, you know, around how we have organization identifiers for public bodies, for governments, this kind of thing as well. But some of those conversations have maybe been a bit inconclusive. And also maybe there's a need to kind of go back to publishers and have a big push to kind of improve them as well. I think I don't know if anyone else wanted to raise this. So Stephen also raised this point around, yes, 3W data is published in the spreadsheet formats. And this is a question of how much of the IATI formats kind of making organizations produce XML as a barrier. So the idea wouldn't be to say those organizations that they should publish data in XML formats. The idea would be to say, you know, if we have this spreadsheet of 3W data, can we convert that into IATI format? So through this existing data collection process, is there a way that we could use that to get the data into IATI format or something that looks very similar? Stephen, you've raised your hand, so maybe I've also misinterpreted what you're saying, or go ahead.
Oh no, thank you, Mark. That's great to hear. Yeah, certainly. Experience we have elsewhere on data standards whereby you make that format simple to produce, but detailed enough can work, I think. So it's great to hear that could be considered for an idea of a last mile, that you really detail that in a format that everyone can work with, and then behind the scenes, you know, it's converted into whatever we want to for the technical reasons. So that's great to hear. Thank you. And then the other point about the registries and the availability or accessibility, I think is something we discovered quite a lot when we were trying to add entities to the orgid.guide list, which lists some of the registries, a very, very small proportion of the registries that we know across the world. And that's a real joint, huge undertaking, I think. And we should accept that some registries are not accessible online digitally and may not exist in the ways that some of us are used to. So I think there's a big challenge there, but thank you again. It's really interesting, Mark. Over.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, and Johanna, I think also makes this point that it's this, and I think referring to organization identifiers and having kind of clear, you know, correct organization identifiers, which actually refer to the legal, you know, legal registration ID of this organization, is the foundation of all important open data, IATI, open contracting, beneficial ownership data, this kind of thing as well. I definitely agree on this as well. Yeah, so Johanna, go ahead. Yes, go ahead, Johanna.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and the point that the additional point I wanted to flag on this though was that one of the benefits that you were flagging about increasing the visibility of local actors is for them to get the credit of their work, and that over time donors become, and everyone really becomes more comfortable working with them, that they can establish their credibility, that they are able to deliver, and that, you know, perhaps over time, therefore, they become more trusted partners in the delivery, in implementing activities. And as such, I think by using the correct identifiers, by giving them the real visibility, they are able to point to that, and it's their legal, you know, their identity is what am I trying to say? They can point to that and they can establish it more credibly down the road, and it becomes a reference, and therefore it will help them in the long run. So even if it's more effort to start with, in the long run, it will be more beneficial to the local partners to have their actual information and their actual identity in the data. Otherwise, you know, if it's kind of the name but maybe not the same one, I can see our contracting services, for instance, like, well, are you sure it's the same? It's the same partner who did this work 3 years ago, because it's not quite the same name, and the legal entity you're showing me is not quite the same as what I see in this report that you're showing me. Whereas if they can build the track record through the data, it will help them create this portfolio or this track record over time. So I think we will help them in the long run this way.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely something we heard in the interviews, Johanna, that local actors said, you know, there's definitely challenges around demonstrating credibility or certification or whatever, or going through due diligence processes, etc., with getting then access to, you know, to particular projects or donor funds as well. So I definitely think them being able to demonstrate that progress through the network, you know, through IATI would help. Nick, I think we have some issues with some of the interpreters being able to unmute their mics. Okay, thanks. I think that's fixed now, hopefully. Okay, so we've got a couple of other hands up. I think Tim was the next one. Let's go ahead.
Yeah, great to be joining the conversation, though. I think this org ID one that comes round and round, we do need to think new ways of solving it. Yes, we need to invest in the org ID infrastructure, but also that piece of understanding the incentives of organizations rapidly filling in the 3W or 4W spreadsheets is not to plug into a global system. It's just to coordinate and find out what's going on locally at that point in time. So I guess there's two things I think for us to think about there. One is that added value work that you've done in terms of manually classifying and structuring data, all that added value stuff at the moment, that exists in silos and gets thrown away at the end of projects. And do we need to be just better at sharing that middle layer of data cleaning and accept that the IATI community is always going to be doing a lot of data cleaning and converting, but right now we all do that off individually and we don't share that work, and sharing that might help us take on the burden of making this data interoperable rather than pushing that burden down onto local organizations that can be quite a sort of extractive or it's our need pushed onto local organizations, but also just to throw in other solutions, you know, which we might explore. And I think when setting up orgid.guide, you know, there's that sense that this is it's a $500,000 million problem to solve globally as a data infrastructure. It's not massive, but it hasn't had that investment in it. But the other option would be, what if we just had people putting the money behind something like the global legal entity identifier and just saying local organizations involved in the AD ecosystem don't have to pay a license fee, it's subsidized by someone, get that ID. You know, I think we need solutions like that step up to the scale of the challenge, which is bigger than any one individual organization, but is not so big that it's insurmountable, and that we need to be talking about it for the next 5 years again.
I mean, this is some great points, Tim, definitely. I mean, yeah, I think we definitely need to think about, you know, over 10 years of this discussion, you know, why have we not made more progress in this as well? And thinking back about, you know, what are the incentives, you know, yes, for local actors, but I think also for other organizations as well, to publish organization identifiers. How can we incentivize and encourage that? Obviously, one part of the answer might be through something like the Publish What You Find Index, or the Transparency Index, or the Data Quality Index that was discussed also today. You know, why would including, you know, identifiers there be particularly useful or important, I guess, and how can we kind of make that case, and then also incentivize organizations to do that as well. But yeah, so if we accept then that we are going to have lots of cases where even for very large organizations, certainly in the medium term, that we won't have this consistent use of these organization identifiers. How else can we overcome this problem? And, you know, sharing, data cleaning, and this kind of thing. Maybe want to push that if we can have a consistent way of doing that and sharing it. Yes, this may be one thing to think about. Yeah. Anand, I think you're next. Please go ahead. If I can. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. I just wanted to flag 2 points. When we interact with local organizations, what we have seen is, one, they don't necessarily work as per activities or projects. So when we as a secondary reporting organization, when we try to cross-fit that with the IATI structure, it doesn't fit properly. So we lose a lot of local level information. The second thing we've constantly heard from the local organizations is, even when we use 3W information, they always say that, okay, organizations, bigger agencies come to us, ask for our data, and then we don't get anything back in return. So if we can somehow come up with a mechanism wherein they can at least see a basic 3W map in return, which I loved in your prototype or tool that you've created, we just need to oversimplify it and make it available for them to reuse it and share it in their own local communities as well. This would incentivize them to come back to IATI and share more data with us.
Thanks, Anand. These are very good points. Yeah. So, yes. So, I mean, I think this point around, you know, the IATI standard being activity-based and not all local actors, and also other, you know, we've definitely seen this in medium and large size organizations as well, don't necessarily run on this activity-based way. I mean, I know some also large UN agencies run on a more kind of results-based or programmatic kind of system as well, that maybe they would have contracts or a number of contracts underneath this, but the general you know, units or approaches is more programmatic than sort of activity-based as well. And this is also something that I think we have had, you know, in the IATI standards. It's been kind of something that I guess we haven't really confronted for the last 10 years, and it's maybe something to think about a little bit, how we would be able to look at incorporating that or dealing with that. And yeah, secondly, in terms of 3W information, so yeah, if you don't get anything back in return, then, you know, what's the incentive to contribute to this? Or and I guess, you know, partly enhancing the visibility and demonstrating, you know, that, you know, taking this 3W data and making it more visible and connecting it with this broader network of IATI publishers maybe does provide some of those incentives, or some of the kind of quid pro quo, I guess, for sharing information 3W templates as well. But definitely also recognizing that, you know, each step we're kind of going down, maybe getting a little bit closer to local actors, but there's a lot of work also at the very final level to collect a lot of that information as well. Stephen, you have your hand up as well. Please go ahead.
Thank you. That was great from Anand, and I don't want to detract from that, or distract from that, sorry, at all. But I know we're talking about local actors here, but I think we see in IATI data quite a lot is descriptions or identification of multilateral and donor entities. You know, you often see Canada or Sweden as the organization. So I know the focus here is local, but equally also IATI does hold quite a lot of keys to help us identify in more granularity donors and multilaterals, but that's really lacking in the data sometimes from donors and multilaterals. So maybe this is a side observation, because I don't want to detract from the valid points made before. Thank you.
I mean, I think this is a very much kind of a relevant observation, Stephen, because yes, you know, it's one thing to, you know, if organizations are not, you know, publishers are not referring to specific real organizations or something, you know, even, you know, it could, you know, obviously Canada is much more specific than sort of donor agency, you know, but yes, it's if you can't identify the specific organization, then it makes it more difficult to provide those links, you know, and again, in this work, we didn't so far really try to kind of actually create links between activities. We were just trying to, link at the more aggregate level, so between organizations or sectors or locations, so that we could basically just show kind of this integrated picture. But even with that, it's really necessary to have, even if you want to be able to provide those links between organizations, you really need to have, you really need to know the specific organization you're talking about rather than something more general. So other thoughts or ideas on this? So yeah, I mean, I think we have so far a few things to take away, I think, from this. So we definitely need to think a bit more, and I think this is as a community, around organization identifiers and what do we do about this? What's the methodology for identifying different sorts of organizations? We have this for, the private sector, generally for NGOs. Sometimes it can be difficult in particular countries if, whether this registration body exists or is public or whatever, but, generally there's a methodology there. But in some cases there won't be, if it's difficult to find the registration body in a particular country, or, and also how do we maintain those kinds of lists also. We've seen mention in the chat also, and I think Stephen and Tim touched on this also, of orgid.guide, which is basically a list of these different registration bodies. But this is not, as I understand it, at the moment being supported. So we need to think about if this is an important piece of infrastructure, then, what do we, how do we need to maintain this or take it forward, and then also to take forward this discussion also around government entities or these kinds of organizations. Also, how do we identify those consistently as well? Yeah, so Stephen says, yeah, so this, and then we have this point around, the IATI standard being activity-based. What do we do when organizations are not kind of structuring their work around activities, that have a kind of start and end date, period of time, a bunch of things associated with that we generally see as, projects or activities in IATI. What do we do if an organization is just kind of doing a sort of work on an ongoing basis as a, as a program or results-based kind of outputs, these kinds of things as well. I think, yes, I think so. I think we, I think Stephen makes a good point that we should have a discussion on this, maybe on Connect, what do we do about this? But this also feels like a bit of a broad discussion, the same as the organization identifies discussion, that maybe can get a bit lost on Connect. So maybe there's a way to have some of these discussions in a future, I don't know, VCE, or I guess this is the sort of tag-like forum that we have now, right? So this is the sort of place where we should be discussing this. So yeah, maybe we need to think about having a kind of some specific kind of sessions to discuss these kinds of more meaty, not necessarily technical, but kind of meaty and detailed issues in future VCEs maybe. And Johanna says maybe around, yes, and yes, I think Stephen, it definitely would be good to discuss this face-to-face properly. Yeah, I think there is a need to basically see these organization identifiers as a way to also not just refer to an organization within IATI data, but across different data sets as well. I think this is the point, if I'm not mistaken, that Johanna's making as well, that you can use the same organization identifier in different data sets as well. If people are raising points in the chat also want to raise their hands, I'm extremely happy to stop talking also with my slightly raspy voice as well. Johanna, go ahead, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify what I actually meant was that we keep calling these IATI identifiers, and it really confuses people because they are looking for an actual identifier that is given by IATI or that exists in an IATI list somewhere, rather than an identifier that designates the organization. And so even in Canada, I'm having to explain over and over and over and over again that yes, we've already decided how we that how we identify organizations, and this is done completely outside of IATI. It has nothing to do with IATI, and we have our own registries, etc. So the fact that we call them IATI identifiers when in fact they have nothing to do with IATI is a source of confusion. So removing that name and simply calling them organization identifiers is a very small step, but perhaps a step towards clarifying that it's an identifier that it belongs to the organization, that designates the organization, and that would be used by in any standard and would be the same for any standard, and will help perhaps help people understand the benefits in terms of interoperability, and that the benefits beyond IATI, and may help other, perhaps a broader range of organizations or standards or people join in that effort, because they could see the benefits for their own efforts on open data.
I think you're muted, Mark.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I was coughing. So yeah, so I think, yeah, in terms of organization, I think in terms of IATI identifiers, you're referring to specifically organization identifiers, right, Johanna? And I think, yeah, so I think we definitely, I think Stephen said something also here around, standardizing the language would be helpful. I think, yes, definitely referring to them as organization identifiers and not as IATI organization identifiers would make sense, because that's what they're supposed to be, right? They're supposed to be, yeah, something that you use across different initiatives and things. Yes. So I think we also have this point, and maybe this is another point we can pick up, I think, later, around this kind of last mile version of IATI standard, or how we, if we were to take this 3W data and convert it into something like the IATI formats, and it's not a, that doesn't meet all of the minimum requirements of the code IATI standard. Is that okay? For certain very small organizations at the end of the chain, and what should that look like? I think this is also something that would be good to pick up on, possibly with Pele in future as well. So I think there's some. Michelle, please go ahead.
No, I'm just going to reiterate what's in the chat, because it is a little pet peeve of mine and it drives me nutty. But one thing that I find challenging is that for so many of the organizations that are in the countries where their registration numbers don't stay constant year after year, and they get their number issued by the IATI Secretariat, I still don't understand why the first 2 digits have to be XM, which tells you nothing about where the organization is. And I've asked that question before, and they said it's because IATI issued the number. I said, no, that's what the next 4 digits are. Just like DAC tells us that the XM DAC are for those that are using DAC numbers, that middle part of the identifier is to tell us what is the registration body that issued the number, not where that body is. So it has more to do about where the organization is, not where the ID issuer is. And I know that sounds crazy, but for people like me that troll other publishers' data to try and find org IDs so that I'm not having to make stuff up myself, or I can at least be inconsistent or consistently incorrect with everyone else, that matters, because then I can just look for the stuff in Somalia or just look at the stuff in wherever. So if the guidance can be tightened up on that, it would go a long way also. It also allows you to say who's operating in the country. If they're all registered, by the identifier what country we're talking about. So that's just my pet peeve, and I would love to see that get tightened up in the guidance. Over.
Yeah, another point on organization identifiers. I think, yes, we have a lot to discuss and think about here as well. Okay, so we have I think about 5 minutes left. Yes, so I just wanted to flag again, so if you want to go and look at the IATI 3W Explorer, It should be updated constantly there. I have to check this again, double check that it's still going. But we really welcome your feedback. You can email us humportal@devinet.org. Oh, Johanna, you have your hand up, I think. Please go ahead.
Well, since we have a couple more minutes, I was just wondering if anyone during your work had raised the issue of safety of well, what happens if wanting the recognition or wanting the visibility, or maybe not wanting it, or what happens if we no longer want it because situation changes. Did that come up?
This is the point where I wish David was, for lots of reasons, was able to join us today, because he undertook those interviews. But as I understand it, based on reading his reports, no, this wasn't actually something that came up a lot. And I think probably the reason for that is because the data had already been published at this point, right? Both from IATI publishers and from the 3W data. So whether those decisions in terms of safety or what makes sense to publish, should already have been made before we then visualized in this interface as well, right? I guess there are definitely here some questions in terms of, in the case of the Somali 3W data, this was published on HDX. And in other cases, though, obviously the 3W reports might not be published, might not be published yet, right? And maybe then a subset of that data might be published on this kind of place as well. So yeah, definitely there are those concerns also to think about in terms of taking the 3W data, which is generally used as a internal kind of coordination process in the cluster system, to then what happens when they're published. But I think for those kinds of issues there, I think the Center for Humanitarian Data has already some guidelines and guidance on what sort of data should be published there, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if you want to go back to me, Hannah.
Oh, no, thanks. It was just trying to connect an earlier discussion, because I mean there's been a recent case where a lot of data that was initially published was then pulled. Yes. And redacted, and so we're now looking into post-publication redactions and processes for that, which are quite different. And so I was just wondering if that had come up. It would be interesting if David has anything to say about that. I'm sure he will join any conversation, follow-up conversations on that.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that we definitely made sure to do though is, and this is also, following the situation earlier this year, to make sure that the tools that we have been developing through this project are continuing to update themselves. Yeah. So as publishers then, as the context changes and organizations choose to remove data, then that should be reflected in this tool, straight away or as quickly as possible as well.
Okay.
And I think this is the best thing that we can do. I think, we had this discussion earlier on the responsible data thing, and the way that third-party tools should, how they should respond. And I think the best way that we can do this is to make sure that we're accurately reflecting publishers' choices around what should actually be published, rather than also trying to, make other decisions as well. Okay, so yeah, thanks everyone for joining the session today. Please do take a look at the portal and provide us your feedback at humportal@devinet.org. Thanks a lot to everybody for this very rich and good discussion. And again, thanks to David, Meganson, and everyone who also helped with research and feeding in to interviews as well. We really appreciate everyone's time and appreciate everyone's time today as well. So last thing to say, we have a closing session now at 12 in 5 minutes in room 1, and the link has been pasted in the chat also by Nick. So if you want to join, then we'll see everyone there. Thanks a lot to everybody.